Okay, well, we are going to go ahead and get started here today. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Preserve Like a Pro, which is part of the Eat Fresh, Eat Local webinar series offered by University of Illinois Extension. Before we start, I do ask that you please mute your microphone and make sure that your camera is turned off so that we do have some strong bandwidth throughout our presentation. Please use the chat box today to ask questions. We're going to try to get through as many as we can by the end of the presentation time. And after today's webinar, we will include a link to the survey. We always greatly appreciate your feedback. Today's webinar and our previous webinars can be found at the Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness state webpage, and I'll share that link with you in the chat box. Today's session will cover the pros and cons of canning, freezing, drying, fermenting as well, your favorite foods. And we do hope that you'll walk away with a better understanding of which food preservation method to use and where to find reputable resources for all your needs this growing season and beyond. University of Illinois Extension is the flagship outreach effort of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We offer research-based educational programs to residents of all Illinois 102 counties and far beyond. I am your moderator, Jenna Smith from University of Illinois Extension, Nutrition and Wellness Educator. I serve Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties. And I'm very excited to welcome our presenter today, Kristen Bogdanas. She is a University of Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness Educator, serving Henry, Mercer, Rock Island, and Stark counties. So welcome to everyone once again, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kristen for her presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Jenna. And I'm just going to double check that we are we recording? Just want to double.
Yes. We are recording.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Kristen, and I've been canning for about 8 years. And one of my favorite things is just seeing all of my filled jars on the shelf and being able to open a jar of jam or salsa midwinter for some of those preserved summer flavors. It's just a very satisfying feeling knowing that I'm able to, be more self-sufficient. So we're going to cover some of these preservation methods that Jenna mentioned. And since we only have 30 minutes today, we're not going to go too in depth with any one of those. But I do want to let you know, we have recorded webinars from last year's Fill Your Pantry series. And we'll be sure to send a link out in today's follow-up email so you can access some longer recorded webinars if you're interested in getting more in depth with any one of these methods. So thinking about why we preserve food, if you're a gardener, well, you know that gardens often produce too much food at one time, well, more than can be eaten before spoilage sets in. So preserving our food helps reduce waste, especially in times of abundance. So this time of year, we have a lot of things popping up in our gardens, available at the farmer's market. So you may be thinking about preserving something. So I'm hoping that this overview today will give you some pros and cons to think about so you can determine which method is going to be right for you based on your needs and the time you have. Preserving our own food also improves variety year-round, can help satisfy personal preferences. Maybe we are wanting to reduce sugar or salt in our diets, and it can help us save money. So we're able to shop our pantry first before heading out to the grocery store. So the first preservation method I want to talk about today is canning. There's a lot of benefits to canning. I think one of the main things is it just helps us be more self-sufficient, knowing that you can preserve your own food for cold winter months. You're able to control ingredients in your canned foods to a certain extent. So for example, if you maybe are wanting to follow a low sugar diet and you want, to purchase some jam or jelly at the grocery store, they're going to have a lot of sugar. But by making your own at home, you can make low or no sugar jam and jelly. You just want to make sure that you purchase that low or no sugar pectin and follow the recipes that are inside that label for particular fruits that you have on hand. Some of the downsides would be the startup costs and time. So canners can range in price from $30 to $70 for a boiling water bath or steam canner, and upwards to $250 for a pressure canner. And other costs include the jars, the lids, other tools like jar lifters and funnels. So just keep that in mind before you get started. In general, there are many benefits to home food preservation, but there's a lot of precautions that we also need to make to ensure that our food is safe to consume. And while it's fun to be creative in the kitchen, playing with different flavor combinations, when it comes to preserving food, it's important to follow tested recipes and procedures to ensure safety and quality of our end product. So before you start canning in particular, make sure you read up on the proper steps, processes, and make sure you have the skills and tools needed before you start canning at home. So let's look at some of the approved methods for home canning. First, we have the boiling water bath canner. And this is specifically used for acidic foods, having a pH of 4.6 or less. So your fruits, jams, acidified products. When it comes to tomatoes, these are right on the border. So they're up closer to the low acid food category. So anytime you can tomato products, you want to make sure those are acidified, either with lemon juice or vinegar. Another approved method is the steam canner. And some of you may have heard of this or have been enjoying this at home. This is one that I really like to use now. It heats up a lot more, quickly than a boiling water bath canner, and there's less water involved in the process, which is nice. So this was approved in 2015, thanks to research published by the University of Wisconsin. And there are certain conditions that need to be met before you start canning with this. So again, you want to make sure you are only using high acid foods, the same kinds of foods that you would process in a boiling water bath canner. You want to make sure you have a tested recipe. One that would be developed for a boiling water canner would be appropriate for a steam canner. And also your processing time must be limited to 45 minutes or less. Because there is less water in this canner, it can boil dry. Now, if this happens while you're canning, you'll have to start that process all over again. So just make sure you're using recipes with 45 minutes or less processing time. Now, when it comes to your low acid foods, these are having a pH higher than 4.6. So this is vegetables, meat, poultry, fish. The only safe way to can these at home is using a pressure canner. In order for a pressure canner to be considered suitable based on USDA guidelines, it must be able to hold a minimum of 4 1-quart jars. And this is not to be confused with a pressure cooker. They are very different. There are also some methods that are not approved that might be circulating on social media or maybe passed down from generation to the next. Some examples of methods that are not recommended include processing by way of the microwave, dishwasher, solar canning, open kettle canning, and oven canning. And also think about, where are you getting your tested recipes? Old cookbooks or recipes that have been handed down through the family may not be using current recommendations. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk more about sources at the end of the presentation, but you'll want to look for a publication date on that recipe of 1985 or newer. All right, let's take a closer look at the gauges, because I get questions about this quite often. So you might have a pressure canner with a dial gauge or a weighted gauge. A dial gauge is going to have a single hand that shows the pressure inside of your canner, and these can fall out of calibration. So it's really important to get these tested every year, which we can do at our local extension offices. Now, if that's not available in your area, you might be able to contact a hardware store or a facility that sells bottled gas. Sometimes they offer that service. If you have a Presto canner, You can also mail your gauge in for testing. You just have to pay for that shipping cost. Weighted gauges, on the other hand, so this is on the right-hand side, these gauges sit on top of the steam vent, and then they'll start to kind of jiggle when your pressure has reached whatever pressure you are looking for, whether that's 5, 10, or 15. And it's important to check the manual that comes with your machine, because some will say that constant movement of that gauge is an indicator of proper pressure, while others say that the gauge only needs to move a few times each minute. So just read up on that before you start canning this summer. Now, some newer canners also have both dial and weighted gauges. So in that case, you want to rely on the weighted gauge to determine the canner, when the canner reaches that pressure you're looking for. And then you can use that dial gauge just as like a visual indicator as it progresses. All right, so just a little overview of proper canning practices. So you want to make sure that you're carefully selecting and washing your food, peeling some fresh foods, possibly hot packing many, as in the case of, boiling water bath canning, adding acids when necessary, such as lemon juice or vinegar to your tomato products, using the correct kinds of jars and the 2-piece self-sealing lids, and processing jars, whether in a boiling water bath, steam canner, or pressure canner, for the correct period of time. And your tested recipe will indicate how long you need to process those. And collectively, all of these practices together are going to ensure safety of your product. It's going to help form a high vacuum in your jars. And then this vacuum is going to keep your liquid in and microorganisms out, which we don't want happening when in storage. And then for best quality, it's probably best to store your finished jars between 50 to 70 degrees. All right, let's move into freezing. So freezing food, it's a great option, and it preserves several of the nutrients that are often lost during the canning process. It also takes less time than canning or dehydrating. Over time, your frozen foods will lose taste, texture, and overall quality, but the good news is that it will remain safe indefinitely. Some of the downsides in my mind is that you have to deal with space constraints. So I just have a small little freezer, so I really can't freeze too much at one time. So that is often an issue for me. And also you have to deal with potential power outages that can lead to food waste. Also, some foods don't freeze very well. And here's a short list of some of those foods. Now, if you're looking to freeze eggs, rather than cooking them first, you can freeze them raw without the shell. And then with your milk sauces or anything that has like a cream base to it, you can just pop those in the blender to revive them a little bit after thawing. There's certain things too that we can do to improve the quality of our frozen foods. So we know that water makes up roughly 70 to 90% of any given fruit or vegetable. And during that freezing process, the water expands and ice crystals are formed. So our job is to make sure that our foods freeze rapidly. And when this happens, we'll have smaller ice crystals, and this will result in a better end product when thawed. Other things you can do would be to freeze your food flat. So I know like blueberries are in season right now and peaches. So I've been freezing a lot of those lately. So I'll just freeze those on an aluminum cookie sheet. And after a couple hours, they're pretty much frozen. I'll stick those in a freezer quart-sized bag, lay those flat. So that helps with space issues in my little freezer. And then they're going to have a better quality too when they're thawed out. All right, let's move on to drying. Drying is one of the oldest methods of food preservation, and drying preserves foods by removing enough moisture from food to prevent spoilage. Some of my favorite foods to dry are herbs. I grow a lot of herbs. That's one thing I have success with. And I like to use those dried herbs for, various recipes throughout winter. So it's nice being able to use my own herbs rather than spending several dollars at the grocery store for those. I also like to do hot peppers. Sometimes I'll grind those for like a hot pepper powder. Also, different kinds of fruit are easy to dry, and vegetable leathers. If you haven't tried that yet, I've put a recipe in your packet that is really delicious. So again, drying is, fairly simple method. It takes up less room in your pantry. And because it's lightweight, it's the perfect food to take hiking and camping. Some of the downsides are that sometimes trial and error is needed just to make sure you're getting it just right. There is a little bit of nutrient loss, particularly during the blanching step of your vegetables. And then of course, the long drying times, which some can take up to 40 hours. So just make sure that you have plenty of time to finish the project and you're not going on vacation, or you would probably want to make sure you're using a dehydrator because no one wants to leave their oven on for 40 hours. So electric dehydrators are recommended because they produce the best quality product. Again, the oven can take up, 2 to 3 times longer. And you probably won't reach that low temperature that you need, that you'll find in an electric dehydrator. And like freezing, you'll want to blanch your vegetables first to stop any enzyme action. So if you omit this step or you don't blanch them correctly, they're going to have a lower flavor and, quality of color afterward. I recommend that you treat fruits. Most fruits need to be pre-treated, and you can do this by using vitamin C, citric acid, lemon juice. You can also use honey and fruit juice. And there's different steps and processes for each of these methods. One fruit that comes to mind that does not need pre-treatment is pineapple. And so I like to do pineapple. It's pretty quick and easy to dehydrate. And then once your foods are fully dried and cooled, they should be stored in some sort of moisture vapor resistant container. Some examples would be like glass jars or freezer containers or bags. And most of your fruits then will last for about a year, and most vegetables 6 months in dry storage. And if you need to preserve them any longer than this, it's probably best to freeze them instead. All right, moving on to my favorite food preservation method is fermentation. This is probably one of the oldest technologies developed by humans, and it's been around for centuries to preserve food and make alcohol. Lots of benefits here. There's minimal startup costs. You likely have all of the, tools and things you need in your kitchen. You need some sort of vessel to ferment your food in. You need water, salt, and the food that you're fermenting. And of course, a weight to make sure that all of your food is submerged below the brine level. Several health benefits are attributed, of course, to the presence of probiotics. Also, the bacteria that's present can help produce vitamins and enzymes that are beneficial for digestion. Fermentation can result in increased levels of vitamins like B and K, and it helps preserve the vitamins A and C, which, if you remember from the previous slides, those are lost during other methods of preservation like canning and blanching when freezing and drying your foods. And in current news, I recently saw an article, researchers at the USDA and North Carolina State University found that a stable, naturally occurring health promoting compound known as GABA was generated through the fermentation. And they found this in cucumbers, they found it in soy sauce, sourdough bread, yogurt, kefir, certain cheeses. And previous research on this GABA compound has been shown to have positive health benefits, such as reducing blood pressure, improving decision-making, reducing anxiety, improving immunity. So it's just really exciting to see all the different research coming out in this area right now. Some of the downsides of fermentation, again, trial and error is sometimes needed. It doesn't always go the way you expect it to go. There is a very long wait time in some instances. If you're making sauerkraut, you could be waiting 4 to 6 weeks before you can dig in. and there's a lack of, quote, tested recipes. So we've mentioned tested recipes a lot through this presentation, especially in terms of canning. But lab tested recipes may not be available for all of the products that you want to ferment. So in that case, it's really important to adhere to safe methods and protocols with an understanding of the science behind fermentation before you get started. So since we're not going too in depth with that today, I encourage you to listen to the recording of the fermentation webinar I did last summer for the Fill Your Pantry series, and we'll put a link to that in the email following this presentation if you'd like to learn more about this particular preservation method. But in short, fermentation really is, a pretty simple, straightforward method. It's easy to do at home. It's economical. And our goal with fermentation is to create an environment where the specific bacteria that produces lactic acid can flourish. So then the spoilage microorganisms cannot grow. And during the fermentation process, these labs, as they're known, will produce byproducts that will aid in the preservation of the food. And starches, sugars, and the vegetables and fruits are then converted into lactic acid, which is a natural preservative, and it inhibits the spoilage and pathogenic bacteria that initially might have been present on the food surface. Carbon dioxide is another byproduct, and it helps maintain that low oxygen condition that we need to safely ferment. And it also helps stabilize the flavor and the color of our vegetables long-term. So if you were to put your fermented vegetables in the fridge, it's going to have that same beautiful color as it did at the beginning. So months from now, it will look pretty much the same. And for those of you that have apprehensions about food safety and fermentation, USDA microbiologist Fred Bright Jr. said that fermented vegetables can be safer than raw vegetables, thanks to the ability of lactic acid, which forms during fermentation to hunt down and kill any harmful bacteria that might be present. All right, so we covered canning, drying, freezing, fermenting, some of the pros and cons, some of the startup costs involved. So I wanted to throw in a few produce items that are popular in this region that you might be thinking of preserving. And I'm going to go over some of the ways that you can preserve each of these food items. So let's start with corn. The sugar in corn is quickly lost. So you want to make sure that you process and preserve your corn as quickly as possible after picking. And if you can't get to it right away, just make sure you put it in the refrigerator to preserve that sweetness. Corn keeps well frozen, and there's lots of ways you can do this. You can do corn on the cob, whole kernel, cream style. You can also can whole kernel or cream style. Just make sure you're using a pressure canner. If you're doing a pickled corn, say a relish, you can process this safely in a boiling water bath canner as opposed to a pressure canner. And while not as common, you can certainly dry your corn. And this would probably be best later for like a summer corn chowder, or you can throw it in a soup jar recipe to give away as gifts later this winter. For tomatoes, again, lots of ways you can preserve tomatoes. Because tomatoes can take up to 40 hours to adequately dry, you probably don't want to do that in your oven. So an electric dehydrator is recommended when drying tomatoes. There's also lots of options when it comes to freezing. You can do whole, sliced, chopped, pureed. You can freeze them raw, cooked as juice or a sauce. And if you're thinking about seasoning, it's probably best to wait to season your tomato product until after it's thawed, because freezing can either strengthen or weaken seasonings that are in there, like the garlic, onion, herbs, and it might produce some off flavors. And because tomatoes vary in their acidity, remember they're right on that border of 4.6, they all have to be acidified before canning to prevent botulism. And then our last produce item here is pumpkin. So I want you to think about safety when planning to preserve pumpkins. This is a low acid vegetable, and attention needs to be made when preserving. So just remember that if you are going to be prepping this vegetable, you don't want to let it sit out for more than 2 hours during preparation time. And also another downside is that we don't have any researched procedures for canning pumpkin butters. So you're not even in a pressure canner. So you cannot can pumpkin butters, anything that's mashed or pureed, unfortunately, or even like pumpkin pickled products like salsa or chutney or relish. If you do make these, you can enjoy them fresh or keep them refrigerated. The only thing that you can when it comes to pumpkin is cubed pumpkin. And again, it's a low acid vegetable, so it has to be done in a pressure canner. Freezing pumpkins is probably the easiest way to preserve, and it's going to yield the best quality product. Or drying. So this is a photo of pumpkin leather. And it's very easy to make. You puree your cooked pumpkin, strain it. Then you can add honey and any spices like cinnamon or nutmeg. And then you can dehydrate that in your food dehydrator. And that recipe is in your packet today. A couple other recipes that you will find is a golden sauerkraut recipe that's always popular in my hands-on workshops. And that's 5 pounds of cabbage with garlic, fresh ginger, turmeric. So it's a beautiful golden color when done. And then there's also a 2-day ginger ale recipe. It's a fermented recipe. So let's talk a little bit about some resources that you may want to tap into. So when thinking about canning, drying, pickling, freezing, there are several research-based resources out there for you to use. One of those is our Watch Your Garden Grow website. So you can search by vegetable, and then you'll see recipes, growing tips, food preservation tips in there with links. There are other state extension sites that you may want to check out. And my go-to is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. I use this quite a bit. I have cited it several times throughout this presentation. Lots of great tested recipes for canning, freezing, drying. There's a couple for fermentation, but there's not a lot. And then there's a lot of like tips. Let's say something went wrong and you're not sure what to do. There's a lot of great tips in there for those instances as well. Now, with regard to fermentation, extension sources are a good place to start, but may not include all that can be fermented. So for these, I would recommend looking for sources that include more information on the science and the process, and not just a recipe, say in a blog or something. So I've listed a few here. These are not extension sources by any means, but they do cover the science, Cultures for Health, and there's a couple books. NOMA, they have really nice step-by-step recipes with pictures. They go into the science really in depth. It's very nice. And then Wild Fermentation is another. There are lots of other books out there. I just didn't have room on the slide to include them all. But if you're interested in more resources on fermentation, feel free to email me and I can shoot you some good sources for those. So that is all for my section of the presentation. Jenna, did you want to follow it up with any questions or?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. And yes, we do have a few questions in the chat box, and I welcome you to go ahead and type in any questions that you might have. Please do make sure that you join us for the next webinar. It's Storing Your Summer Harvest on August 18th. So please make sure you are registered for that if you are interested. And also, I did put in the chat box a link to a Qualtrics survey. So we really appreciate you filling out that short survey. I'll go ahead and get you to a couple of questions. Kristen, I think we've got a few here. I know we only got about a minute left. Do you want to stay on and answer a few of these, Kristen, or?
Yes, I can stay on and answer a few questions. So if anyone wants to, stick around, please do so. If you have other things to do over your lunch hour, please feel free to leave, and we'll get this recording out to you later this afternoon with the links that I mentioned earlier.
Very good. Okay, well, good. So one of the questions was, when we were talking about dehydration, what thickness should the fruit or veggie slices be used for the dehydrator?
It might depend. My best tip probably would just to make sure they're all the same thickness. You don't want some drying out quicker than others, so you want them all to be uniform thickness. That would be my best suggestion. And with my electric dehydrator, I have to rotate those trays every so often. So the ones on the bottom seem to dry out first. So, every couple hours I'll go in and rotate those trays around.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Are electric pressure canner cookers okay? And if they are okay, is there anything particular that you want to look for when purchasing?
Electric pressure cookers are not approved to process your low acid foods at home. No, you'll want to make sure you get one of the pressure canners that we mentioned today in the presentation.
And it's so disappointing. You look at those and they give you instructions on how to do it, and they say that you can, but yeah, the USDA does not recommend using those electric pressure canners or pressure cookers for a canner. So, okay, let's see. Scrolling here. A follow-up question. Oh, okay. Let's see. I already answered that one. Let's get to, is it possible to use jars from store-bought foods for any preserving type disgust?
I would not use jars that have been purchased from the store. You want to use the jars that are sold specifically for canning, because that's tempered glass, so it's going to hold up longer for repeated uses. The ones that you buy in the store usually are not the same quality and can shatter when pressure canning.
Okay, here we go. I've heard this one before too. I received a jar of pickles from a friend about 20 years ago. Are they still safe to eat?
I have not heard that question, Jenna.
I get a lot of questions on
Really?
having food products for a very long time.
Yeah. Well, what would you recommend for this one?
20 years, I always say no, throw them out. 20 years is too long. Now,
I personally wouldn't eat that, but
no, it's too long. I will say that, if you're doing things correctly, that they should be safe indefinitely. But for one thing, the quality is going to be pretty poor on those pickles. And the other thing is that we just can't really ensure that they were done correctly. We don't know if this friend and whether or not they followed the safe, procedures. And 20 years ago is a long time. There have been some new safety guidelines since that time. So whenever you have products that have been around for that long, I recommend throwing them out.
That's good advice. Follow that.
Okay. Can you give some more examples of fermented foods? I'm not super familiar with them.
Sure. Yeah. There's lots of different things out there. You can do, well, the most common probably is sauerkraut. Everybody's probably familiar with that. And that's a good one to start with. Kimchi would be another example that's, similar, just has like different spices, flavors added to that. You can do fermented dairy products. So yogurt, cottage cheese, sour cream, kefir or kefir, it's pronounced differently. That's a drinkable type yogurt. I really like it on yogurt. I really like it on oatmeal. There is kombucha. It's a fermented tea. So lots of different options out there.
Okay, very good. Let's see. What were the trusted and tested canning books you mentioned again?
All right, so let me go back here a slide.
Yeah.
We have the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Now, this is a website where you can access tested recipes. This information is also available in the 6th edition of So Easy to Preserve, if you would like the book.
Very good. Okay. For the ginger ale recipe, can you use stevia or monk fruit instead of sugar?
No, unfortunately, sugar cannot be substituted. It's going to be eaten up basically. So it's needed for the fermentation process to occur appropriately.
Okay, very good. And when we say, okay, I think we know this. When we say approved recipes, who is the approved by?
So Georgia, so the site that is listed here, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, the University of Georgia, they are responsible for all of the research-based tested recipes that you will find on these sites. So that is where the research is stemming from.
Okay, very good. I think I've gotten to all of the questions, but if I haven't, please go ahead and put that in the chat box, and we'll just wait here just a few more seconds here to see if anything comes in. But if not, we really thank you so much for attending today and really appreciate all of your great questions. And if you have any more questions, of course, just please let us know, and you can certainly contact either Kristen or I. So have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Kristen, if you're still on, I did get one more question. What about freezing strawberries? Do you slice them or do you leave them whole?
I think you could do either. I would probably slice mine.
Yeah.
I haven't done that in a long time though. I'd have to look it up to see the best method.
Yeah, and I think you can do either. I think it also depends too whether or not, you want to add a little bit of sugar on them, prior to freezing them or not. But freezing them kind of either whole or sliced. I like the method that you talked about where you kind of put them on a tray first, so that when you get them out, they're not all in one big clump.
Yes.
Unless you want them to be in one big clump. If you're making, strawberry sauce, for maybe ice cream or some kind of topping like that, then it's okay to have them more clumped in a lot of those nice juices. Now
I'd probably be using mine for smoothies, so I want them to be all separated so I can
There you go. Yep. Okay. Okay, I don't see any others, Kristen. So I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking on.
Yes, thank you, Jenna, for moderating.
Absolutely. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.